After all our recent breakdowns of the bending techniques, one thing that's noticeable is that all four bending disciplines follow more or less consistent styles, all rooted in real-world martial arts. Earthbending is based on the Hung Gar style of Kung Fu, firebending on the northern Shaolin style of the same, waterbending is based on Tai Chi, and airbending on Baguazhang. This gives the moves all the benders do a consistent aesthetic that matches the nature of their element, but they all have outliers, and these are worth going into more. Welcome to the Amagi. In today's video, we're going over the unusual moves in the bending arts. Before we begin, we publish a new video every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. Overlap. Let's start with the most explicit one, namely lightning redirection, which is considered wholly separate from lightning generation because of the wildly different mindsets and techniques it requires. Iroh tells Zuko that he created the technique himself by studying waterbenders and the way they let energy flow, opposite the aggressive nature of firebending. It can easily catch people off guard, as it did Ozai twice when both Zuko and Aang caught his lightning, but both stopped short of killing him with it. It is notable that fire and water are normally opposites, and yet with this, their bending styles complement each other. But there's one more ability where they complement each other: healing. When applied properly, firebending can be used to sense chi paths to interpret spiritual energy. However, firebending can seemingly only sense when something is wrong, while waterbending can actively heal it. There's more overlap for other elements. Air and fire are not elemental opposites, but they are spiritual opposites, hence Aang's initial trouble with firebending. For Korra, however, this meant that after overcoming her block from airbending, she didn't really use it as airbenders normally did, she used it much more like firebending. Quick jabs, aggressive punches, it suited her personality down to the ground, but was much to the dismay of Tenzin. Another person to have a very unusual style of airbending makes a lot of sense: Zahir. Prior to receiving his airbending ability, he was already a skilled fighter in hand-to-hand combat, and used it more as an extension of that, a vagabond style of fighting. He was well versed in air nomad history, which probably did help him, but in the end, when he was fighting Tenzin, his newly learned skills proved inferior to Tenzin's mastery, as Zahir would most likely have lost that fight if it had not been for the rest of the Red Lotus coming to his aid. Lava bending is another place where the bending arts overlap quite a lot, as when we see Bolin and Ghazan do it, their moves much more closely resemble water bending than they do normal earth bending. Lava being a liquid means that benders have to adjust their fighting style, and do so by making their motions much more fluid. The same goes for sand, with how loose it is, and for the purpose of moving their sailors around, sandbenders appear to move almost like airbenders. But with earthbending being such a widespread and diverse art, there are more outliers than that. Even Toph's style is different from that of most earthbenders of her time. Instead of the Hung Gar style that most would use, her style more closely resembles the praying mantis style, the most notable feature of which is the wrists bending inwards. Everywhere throughout the show this is shown, especially with metal bending. But that's not the only change. If you take a close look at the dancing troupe in Zaofu, you'll notice that their very fluid style to create an elegant dancing pattern also resembles waterbending more than it does traditional earthbending. This translates to fighting as well, as we see Kuvira fighting with Korra in the cockpit of her giant mech. Kuvira herself is an outlier as well, as she seems to prefer bending metal over bending earth, since that can be manipulated much more finely. Personal preference. But this actually brings us to an interesting point, namely that no matter how practical or impractical a fighting style is, personal preference plays a big role in how benders choose to employ them. We already touched on how Korra uses airbending, but Kuvira falls into a different category with earthbending as well, preferring circular motions that resemble airbending almost as much as earthbending. Instead of blocking, she dodges, whereas traditional earthbender philosophy would tell her to block. And it even applies on a smaller scale. Compare the way Lin uses her earthbending with the way Suyin uses it. Everything we know points towards Toph having been the one to teach them earthbending, yet they both employ different styles. Lin's is more grounded and direct, whereas Suyin's is more flowing and smooth. The same is true for Kaya. Being the daughter of both a waterbender and an airbender, her waterbending seems to be based more around evading than redirecting, like airbending instead of normal waterbending. Even when she pulls water from a source when preparing for an attack, she spins it around herself like no other waterbender is seen doing, but is much more reminiscent of an airbender preparing for battle. Again, a lot of this is down to personal preference, because one other waterbender with an unusual style is Tonraq. A barrel-chested man, a general in the armies of the Northern Water Tribe, His style seems to have less in common with normal waterbending as it does with earth and firebending. He seemingly prefers to fight with brute strength instead of tactical cunning, which often does lead to his defeat, like when he is fighting Unalaq and Zahir. It's clear that this strategy is a high-risk, high-reward one, since he is seen overpowering people with it, and had he landed his Ice Dagger lunge on Zahir, that hit would most likely have been fatal. However, it left him wide open instead, vulnerable for Zahir to push him off the edge of the cliff. Bloodbending is the last waterbending technique that is vastly different from any other. The movements don't resemble any actual martial arts technique as much as they do actual puppetry, which makes sense given what the technique is used for. Overall, the inventor of bloodbending, Hama, had adjusted her waterbending to keep her ability hidden, as she lived in the Fire Nation and would have gotten her thrown in prison again, or worse. Instead, she came up with techniques that focused on concealment, like the ice claws, or on being resourceful, like drawing water from nearby plants. A bender can even switch up their style purely for strategic effect as well. Traditional waterbending fails Katara when fighting Hama because they appear to be evenly matched, so she resorts to outright blocking Hama's attack, much to her shock. The variations in firebending are a bit more subtle. The dancing dragon form that Aang and Zuko learn in the Sun Warrior City is a collection of high punches, low kicks, and double punches with both fists. That series of 10 moves was first seen, chronologically anyway, being taught to Avatar Wan by the White Dragon to perfect his firebending technique. But not much else really stands out, mostly because firebenders are not limited by the availability of a source of fire like water and earthbenders are. The changes are mostly spiritual, because during the 100-Year War, firebending became much more about being fueled by aggression and rage, but Aang and Zuko learn that it can also be fueled by the same energy that gives life. Extreme cold can be used in an attempt to keep firebenders from using their bending, but Iroh discovered how to use the Breath of Fire technique to keep himself warm by drawing from his inner fire. He mastered this technique to such an impressive degree that it earned him the nickname the Dragon of the West. Modern times. Lastly, there is the modernization of bending techniques to focus on. When Korra arrives in Republic City, she realizes that a lot of the techniques she has been taught are old-fashioned, and that urban life has changed bending as well. Waterbending was limited again by the availability of water, and the fact that carrying around large quantities was impractical. Instead, waterbenders adjusted their fighting style to be a lot more aggressive, to make their limited supply of water count. We don't actually see too much of this, as the waterbender we see most of in Republic City is Korra, and she's not limited to water, she just resorts to one of the other elements at her disposal. We do see this in Viper, the leader of the Triple Threats, but it's soon turned against him. His quick-fire water bullet is stopped by Korra with relatively little effort, who freezes it around his head. Even when a source of water is abundant, this aggression does carry through, as is seen when Korra is fighting Tarlok. His speed and ferocity isn't seen anywhere else, and is much more reminiscent of the quick bursts seen in modern earthbending than it is in traditional waterbending. Earthbending underwent a similar change, what with the destruction of property being a much bigger concern when roads are paved and buildings expensive. Instead of the giant boulders and huge fissures we see earthbenders use elsewhere, instead they limit themselves to bending smaller rocks with more precision, so to cause less damage. Bolin is the prime example of this, and he even demonstrates how earthbending has changed. Ordinarily it's all about a steady stance as Toph taught Aang, but in modern times.
Stay light on your toes, right up until the moment when you need to dig in and strike, then pop pop!
And he practices what he preaches, not only in the arena, but also when he is in genuine fights. But Korra doesn't abide by these same rules, and this might actually give her an edge. Every time she displays massively powerful feats of much more traditional earthbending, it throws the people she fights in Republic City off their rocker, since they are used to fighting that more modern, less destructive style. So perhaps this proves that traditional earthbending is traditional for a good reason. Firebending didn't need to undergo nearly as many changes. Its natural flexibility meant that there wasn't any real need for firebenders to adjust their style. The main difference we see is that lightning bending, both generation and redirection, is much more commonplace now, so much so that it's used to generate the electricity to power the city. Outside of that, the only major change we see is in the pro-bending arena, but that is much more bound to the rule set than it is to what's practical. In order to avoid injuring other players, bending flamethrower-like long bursts of fire is illegal. Only quick jabs are allowed in the ring. A similar rule is in place for waterbenders. They aren't allowed to bend constant hose-like streams, and earthbenders are limited to the earthen discs. That might explain why Bolin bends the way he does, Going back to personal preference, it's the way he's used to fighting in the ring, so he does it outside the ring as well. In conclusion, there is a lot of overlap between the four elements and the way benders can use that to their advantage. Some are more obvious than others, but the ways in which bending techniques vary, even within the same element, are practically endless, ranging from personal preference of the bender to the time period and location they live in. Benders will always adjust their fighting styles to their surroundings, whatever form that takes. Did you enjoy this video and want to know more about the other bending techniques? Then check out this playlist. For more great videos from the Amagi, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.